Kids of tough dads. When did you see a side of him no one else did? My dad was the kind of guy you didn't mess with. 6'2", hands like catcher's mitts, and a stare that could make you confess to crimes you didn't commit. He ran a landscaping business, barking orders at his crew like a drill sergeant. And at home, he wasn't much different. Rules were ironclad. Home by 9, dishes done before bed, no back talk. My buddies called him the General, half joking, half terrified. Me, I'm Jake, 16, stuck navigating his boot camp vibe with my mom and little brother, Max, who's 10 and already better at staying on dad's good side. I always wondered if there was more to him than the tough guy act, some piece of him he kept locked away. I got my answer last summer, but it came at a cost, and it started with a fight that shook our house to its foundation. Growing up under dad's roof felt like living in a pressure cooker. He wasn't cruel, but he was relentless. If I brought home a C, he'd sit me down for a lecture about owning my future. If I missed a soccer practice, he'd make me run laps in the backyard until my legs burned. Life's not a free ride, Jake, he'd say, his voice like gravel. Mom would try to smooth things over, saying he just wanted us to succeed, but it felt like he was training us for a war we didn't sign up for. Max, being younger, got off easier, but even he knew to keep his head down when dad was in a mood. I didn't hate him, but I craved a moment where he'd just be normal. Maybe crack a joke, or tell me he was proud without a butt attached. Deep down, I wondered if he even liked us, or if we were just his responsibility. The summer I turned 16, things were already tense. I'd been working part-time at dad's business, hauling mulch and trimming hedges under the July sun. It was grueling, and dad didn't cut me any slack. "You're not here to goof off," he'd snap if I took a water break too long. I was saving up for a used car, dreaming of the freedom it'd bring, but every paycheck felt like a drop in the bucket. At home, dad was extra edgy because his business was struggling. Some big client had bailed, and he was scrambling to cover payroll. Mom kept trying to cheer him up, but he'd just grunt and disappear into the garage to tinker with his tools. Max and I tiptoed around him, knowing one wrong move could set him off. It all came to a head one muggy evening in late July. Dinner was quiet, just the clink of forks and Mom's nervous small talk about her garden club. Max was rambling about a science fair project, something about building a model rocket, when Dad cut him off. "Focus on eating, not yapping," he said, not even looking up from his plate. Max shrank back, and I felt my jaw tighten. I was sick of the silence, sick of Dad acting like we were his employees instead of his kids. Before I could stop myself, I muttered, "Maybe he'd talk less if you didn't shut him down all the time." The room froze. Mom's fork hovered mid-air, and Max's eyes went wide. Dad's head snapped up, his stare boring into me. "What'd you say?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. I knew I should back down, but something in me snapped. "I said you're always on us," I shot back. "Max was just excited, and you act like it's a crime. You treat us like we're failing you every day." Mom gasped. "Jake, honey, let's not." But Dad raised a hand, silencing her. He leaned forward, his knuckles white around his glass. "You think you can talk to me like that in my house? After everything I do for you? Everything you do?" I laughed, the sound bitter. "You mean working us like dogs and acting like we're never good enough? I'm busting my butt for your business, and all I get is grief." My voice was shaking now, and I could feel Max staring, but I couldn't stop. Dad stood up, towering over the table. "You're out of line, Jake. You don't know what it takes to keep this family afloat. Maybe I'd know if you ever talked to us." I shouted, standing too. "You're not a dad, you're a boss." The words hung in the air, and for a second, I thought he might actually hit me. Instead, he pointed at the door. "Get out. Now." I didn't think. I just grabbed my sneakers and stormed out, slamming the front door so hard the windows rattled. The night air was thick, crickets chirping like nothing had happened. I walked down our street, my heart pounding, replaying the fight. Part of me felt free, like I'd finally said what I'd been holding in for years. But another part was terrified. What if Dad never let me back in? What if I just burned my whole family down? I ended up at the park a few blocks away, sitting on a bench by the empty baseball field. My phone buzzed. "Mom, texting please come home, Jake." He didn't mean it. I didn't reply. I wasn't ready to face him. I sat there for hours, watching the stars come out, trying to figure out why Dad was so hard on us. I remembered stories Mom told me about his childhood, how his own dad walked out when he was a kid, leaving his mom to raise 3 boys alone. Dad had to work young, dropping out of high school to help pay bills. Maybe that's why he pushed us so hard, I thought. But it didn't excuse treating us like we were never enough. Around midnight, I heard footsteps crunching on the gravel path. My stomach twisted, expecting some cop telling me to move along. Instead, it was Dad, his work jacket slung over his shoulder, looking tired, not angry, just worn out. He didn't say anything at first, just sat on the bench a few feet away. I braced for a lecture, but he just stared at the field, his hands clasped between his knees. Finally, he spoke, his voice softer than I'd ever heard it. "You know, I used to play ball out here. Shortstop. Wasn't half bad." I blinked, caught off guard. Dad never talked about his past. Not like that. "Why'd you stop?" I asked, cautious. He shrugged, a small, sad smile tugging at his mouth. "Life got in the way. Had to grow up fast." He paused, then added, "Didn't want that for you and Max. That's why I push you." Maybe I pushed too hard. I didn't know what to say. This wasn't the Dad I knew, the one who just kicked me out. He sounded almost sorry, but I was still mad, still hurt. "You didn't just push," I said, my voice tight. "You made us feel like we're failing you, like we're not even your kids, just projects." He flinched, just a little, and I saw something flicker in his eyes. Regret, maybe. He didn't argue, didn't defend himself. He just nodded, like he was taking it in. "Come home, Jake," he said quietly. "We'll talk more tomorrow." I followed him back, not because I was ready to forgive him, but because I was too tired to fight anymore. The walk was silent, but it wasn't the usual tense silence. It was like we were both trying to figure out what came next. When we got home, Mom hugged me so tight I could barely breathe, and Max peeked out from his room, whispering, "You okay?" I nodded, but my head was spinning. Dad had shown me a crack in his armor, a glimpse of someone who wasn't just the general. But I didn't know what to do with it, or if it'd last. The morning after our fight, I woke up expecting the house to feel like a battlefield. I'd yelled at Dad, called him out in a way I'd never dared before, and he'd shown up at the park, not to drag me home, but to talk. Actually, talk. That soft-spoken guy who mentioned playing shortstop wasn't the Dad I knew, and I wasn't sure what to make of him. Part of me wanted to believe he meant it, that he'd ease up, but another part was braced for him to snap back to being the general, barking orders like nothing happened. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering if last night was a fluke or the start of something different. Downstairs, the kitchen was quieter than usual. Mom was flipping pancakes, her usual cheer dialed down, and Max was doodling on a napkin, sneaking glances at me like I was a bomb about to go off. Dad was at the table, sipping coffee, his work boots already on. I hesitated in the doorway, half expecting him to launch into a lecture about respect. Instead, he looked up and nodded, just a quick jerk of his head. "Morning, Jake," he said, his voice neutral, like we hadn't screamed at each other 12 hours ago. I mumbled a morning, back and slid into my chair, grabbing a pancake to avoid eye contact. Mom shot me a small smile, but the air was thick, everyone waiting for someone else to make the first move. Finally, Dad cleared his throat. "Got a job today at the community center," he said, not looking at any of us. "They need the garden redone. Could use an extra hand." He paused, then added, "Jake, you in?" I froze, fork halfway to my mouth. Dad never asked me to work with him, he just told me. And after last night, I figured he'd want me as far away as possible. Max's eyes widened, and Mom's eyebrows shot up, but I kept my face blank. "Sure," I said, trying to sound casual, though my heart was racing. Was this his way of making up, or was I walking into a trap? The community center was a rundown brick building, a few miles from our house, with a patchy lawn and a garden that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. Dad's crew was already there, unloading shovels and bags of soil from the truck. I'd worked with them before, but today felt different. Dad didn't bark at me to get moving or criticize my technique. He just handed me a rake and said, "Start over there by the fence." I nodded, waiting for the catch, but he turned away, talking to his foreman, Pete, about drainage plans. I got to work, raking up dead leaves and pulling weeds, my mind spinning. Was this his version of a peace offering, or was he just too tired to fight? As the morning wore on, I kept stealing glances at Dad. He was in his element, directing the crew with that commanding voice, but he wasn't as harsh as usual. He even laughed once when Pete tripped over a hose, a low chuckle I barely recognized. Around noon, a woman from the community center came out, Miss Rivera, who ran the after-school programs. She was short with a no-nonsense vibe, but her smile was warm. "This is looking amazing, Tom," she said to Dad. "The kids are gonna love it." Dad shrugged, wiping sweat off his forehead. "Just doing our job," he said, but I caught a flicker of pride in his eyes. Miss Rivera turned to me, her smile widening. "You must be Jake. Your dad says you're a hard worker." I nearly dropped my rake. "Dad said that? About me?" I mumbled a thanks, my face burning, and glanced at him, but he was busy adjusting a wheelbarrow, pretending not to hear. Miss Rivera kept talking, saying how the garden would be a safe space for the kids, a place to plant veggies and learn about nature. "Means a lot to have volunteers like you," she added, and I realized she thought I was here by choice, not because Dad dragged me along. I didn't correct her, but the idea that Dad had bragged about me, to someone else, no less, stuck with me. We broke for lunch, sitting on the tailgate of Dad's truck. The crew was joking around, but Dad was quieter, eating his sandwich and staring at the half-finished garden. I sat next to him, picking at my chips, trying to find the courage to say something. Finally, I went for it. "This place is kinda cool," I said, keeping it light. "Better than hauling mulch for rich people's lawns." He snorted, a sound that might have been a laugh. "Yeah, well, this one's pro bono," he said. "Rivera's been after me for months, said the kids deserve something nice." I raised an eyebrow. "Dad doing free work? That was new. Why'd you say yes?" I asked, genuinely curious. He didn't answer right away. He took a swig of water, then said, "Grew up around here. This center was all I had some days. Kept me out of trouble." His voice was low, like he was sharing something he didn't usually let out. I waited, hoping he'd keep going, and after a moment, he did. "My brothers and me, we'd come here after school. Mom was working. Dad was gone. They had this old basketball court out back. Used to shoot hoops till dark." He paused, his eyes distant. Place was a dump, but it was ours. I stared at him, trying to picture it. Dad, as a kid, not much older than Max, dribbling a basketball on a cracked court. He'd never talked about his childhood like this, not in detail. Mom had mentioned his dad leaving, but Dad always brushed it off, like it didn't matter. Now, hearing him talk about the community center, I saw a glimpse of someone else. Someone who'd been a kid with dreams, not just the guy who ran our house like a military base. "Didn't know you played basketball," I said, keeping my tone even, not wanting to scare him off. He shrugged, a small smile tugging at his mouth. "Wasn't bad. Too short for varsity, though." I laughed, and for a second it felt like we were just two guys talking, not father and son ready to butt heads. But then Pete called him over to check some measurements, and the moment was gone. I went back to work, my head buzzing. Dad had opened up just a little, and it was messing with me. I wanted to believe he was trying, but years of his tough guy act made me wary. What if this was just a one-off, and tomorrow he'd be back to yelling? The afternoon got busier. Ms. Rivera brought out a group of kids from the summer program to help, which mostly meant them running around, tossing dirt, and asking a million questions. One kid, a skinny boy named Leo, maybe 8, latched onto me, following me around like a shadow. "You're strong," he said, watching me haul a bag of soil. "Bet you could lift a car." I grinned, flexing a little. "Maybe a small one." Leo laughed, then pointed at Dad, who was showing another kid how to plant a seedling. "Is that your dad? He's scary." I glanced over. Dad was crouched down, his big hands gently patting dirt around a tiny plant, his face focused but not stern. "Yeah," I said, "but he's not so bad." Seeing Dad with those kids was weird. He wasn't barking orders or snapping at them for messing up. He was patient, explaining how deep to dig, even laughing when one girl got mud on his jeans. Leo kept talking, telling me how he came to the center every day because his mom worked late. Miss Rivera's nice, but I wish we had a real garden, he said. My grandma used to grow tomatoes. I nodded, thinking about what Dad had said, how this place had been his lifeline. Maybe that's why he was here, giving back something he'd lost. By the time we wrapped up, the sun was setting, and the garden was starting to take shape. Neat rows of soil, a few seedlings in place, and a cleared spot for a bench. Ms. Rivera thanked us, her eyes shining like we'd handed her the moon. Dad just nodded, but I could tell he was pleased. On the drive home, I waited for him to say something about last night, to clear the air, but he didn't. Instead, he turned on the radio, some old rock song I didn't know, and tapped his fingers on the steering wheel. It was the most relaxed I'd seen him in months. When we pulled into the driveway, Mom was waiting on the porch, Max kicking a soccer ball nearby. How'd it go? She asked, her voice cautious, like she was testing the waters. Fine, Dad said, then looked at me. Jake did good. My jaw nearly hit the ground. A compliment? From Dad? Without a butt attached? Mom smiled, and Max ran over, asking if I saw any cool tools. I ruffled his hair, still processing. Dad headed inside, but before he did, he turned back. We're back there tomorrow, he said. You coming? It wasn't a command, more like a question. I nodded. Yeah, I'm in. That night, I lay in bed, replaying the day. Dad at the community center, talking about his childhood, laughing with those kids. It was like meeting a stranger who wore my dad's face. But I wasn't naive. One day didn't erase years of him being hard on us, of making me feel like I was never enough. Still, something had shifted, like a door cracking open. I didn't know if he'd keep it open, or if I'd have the guts to walk through. All I knew was, for the first time, I wanted to try. The next few days at the community center felt like stepping into a parallel universe. Dad was still Dad, gruff, focused, quick to call out anyone slacking, but there was this undercurrent, something softer I couldn't quite pin down. After our fight and that night at the park, I'd seen a crack in his armor, and working with him on the garden project was widening it. He wasn't suddenly all warm and fuzzy, but he was different, less like the general, and more like a guy trying to figure out how to meet me halfway. I kept waiting for the other shoe to drop, for him to snap back to his old ways, but every day at the center chipped away at my doubts, and I started to see pieces of a man I'd never known. We were at the center every morning that week, transforming the garden bit by bit. The crew hauled in new soil, laid down gravel paths, and built raised beds for vegetables. I was on seedling duty, planting tomatoes and peppers under Miss Rivera's watchful eye. The kids from the summer program were always around, making it chaotic, but kind of fun. Leo, the 8-year-old who'd called Dad scary, was my unofficial sidekick, chattering about everything from superheroes to his grandma's cooking. You think these tomatoes will be as good as hers? He asked one day, poking at the soil. Better, I said, grinning. We're pros. He laughed, and I caught Dad watching us from across the garden, a small nod of approval on his face. That nod stuck with me. Dad didn't dish out praise often, and when he did, it was usually backhanded, like, not bad, but you could have done it faster. But lately, he'd been different. The day before, when I'd figured out how to fix a wobbly trellis without being asked, he'd clapped me on the shoulder and said, "Good thinking, Jake." No lecture, no critique, just a compliment. It was small, but it hit me hard. I'd spent years chasing his approval, and now that it was coming without strings, I didn't know how to handle it. Part of me wanted to lean into it, but another part was scared it wouldn't last. The center wasn't just changing how I saw Dad. It was showing me a side of him the crew didn't even know. One afternoon, Miss Rivera pulled him aside to talk about adding a small fountain, something about it being calming for the kids. I was nearby, stacking bags of mulch, close enough to overhear. "You're doing more than we ever expected, Tom," she said. "This place hasn't looked this good since I was a kid." Dad shrugged, his usual go-to, but his voice was low. "Just glad it's helping," he said. Miss Rivera smiled. "It's personal for you, isn't it?" Dad hesitated, then said, "Yeah, owe this place a lot." I froze, my hand still on the mulch bag. He'd hinted at his connection to the center before, but hearing him admit it to someone else felt different, like he was letting her in on a secret. I wanted to ask him more, but the moment passed, and he was back to directing the crew. Still, his words lingered. That evening, as we drove home, I took a chance. "You said you owe the center," I started, keeping my eyes on the dashboard. "What'd you mean?" He gripped the steering wheel a little tighter, and for a second, I thought he'd shut me down. But then he sighed, long and heavy. "When I was a kid, things were rough," he said. "Mom worked 2 jobs. My brothers and I were on our own a lot. This place, back when it was just a rec room and a busted court, it gave us somewhere to go. Kept us from running wild." He glanced at me, his eyes softer than usual. Miss Rivera was one of the counselors then. She didn't let me quit. I blinked, trying to picture it. Dad, my tough-as-nails dad, as a scrappy kid, needing someone like Miss Rivera to keep him in line. It was hard to wrap my head around. "You never told us that," I said, my voice quiet. He snorted, a half laugh. "Not exactly a bedtime story, Jake." But he didn't sound angry, just tired, like carrying that memory was heavier than he let on. I wanted to push, to ask what else he'd kept from us, but something told me to let it be. For now, this was enough. Back home, things were still a little off. Mom was thrilled Dad and I were getting along, but she kept watching us like she was waiting for another blow-up. Max was his usual self, bouncing between homework and begging me to play video games, but even he noticed the shift. "Dad's not yelling as much," he said one night, sprawled on the couch. "It's weird." I laughed, ruffling his hair. "Yeah, weird's one word for it, but it wasn't just weird, it was hopeful, and that scared me. Hope made you vulnerable, and I wasn't sure I was ready to trust across Dad's new side. The next day at the center, things got intense. A delivery of paving stones arrived late, and the crew was scrambling to get the paths done before a big community event Miss Rivera had planned for the weekend. Dad was in full foreman mode, but he wasn't snapping at anyone, just moving fast, checking measurements, and pitching in with the heavy lifting. I was hauling stones with Pete, the foreman, when he leaned over and said, "Your old man's different this week. You do something to him?" I shrugged, not sure how to answer. "Maybe he's just in a good mood." Pete laughed. "Tom, good mood? That's a first." But Pete was right. Dad was different. When one of the younger crew guys dropped a stone and cracked it, I braced for him to lose it. Instead, he just said, "Happens. Grab another one." The guy looked as shocked as I felt. Later, when Leo and a few other kids got underfoot trying to help by carrying tiny pebbles, Dad didn't shoo them away. He crouched down, showing them how to place the stones just right. His voice patient, almost gentle. "Like this, see?" he said, guiding Leo's hands. "Gotta make it sturdy." Leo beamed, and I felt a pang in my chest. This was the dad I'd always wanted, but seeing him like this now, with strangers' kids, made me jealous and proud at the same time. That afternoon, Miss Rivera brought out lemonade for everyone, and the kids ran around laughing and splashing each other. Dad and I sat on a bench, catching our breath. He was quiet, watching the chaos with a faint smile. "Reminds me of the old days," he said, almost to himself. "You and your brothers?" I asked, taking a sip of lemonade. He nodded. "Yeah, we'd make a mess, drive the counselors nuts, but they never kicked us out." He paused, then added, "Made me think I could be somebody, you know? Not just another screw-up." His words hit me hard. "Dad, a screw-up? The guy who ran a business, kept our family fed, never missed a bill? It didn't add up." "You're not a screw-up," I said, the words slipping out before I could stop them. He looked at me, surprised, then gave a small laugh. "Thanks, kid." But I came close. He didn't elaborate, and I didn't push. But that moment, sitting there with lemonade and the sound of kids laughing, felt like the closest we'd ever been. By Friday, the garden was nearly done. The beds were planted, the paths were set, and Miss Rivera was buzzing with excitement about the event. A ribbon-cutting thing, with food and music. She kept thanking Dad, who just waved her off, but I could tell he was proud. That night, as we cleaned up, Leo ran up to me, holding a tiny tomato plant in a pot. "Miss Rivera said I could give this to you," he said, thrusting it into my hands. "For being awesome." I laughed, ruffling his hair. "You're pretty awesome yourself." Dad was nearby, coiling a hose, and he glanced over, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Better take care of that," he said. "Leo's counting on you." Driving home, I held the plant in my lap, feeling weirdly protective of it. Dad was humming along to the radio, some old song about rambling men, and for once, the silence between us wasn't heavy. I wanted to say something, to tell him I was glad we were doing this, but the words felt too big. Instead, I said, "Leo's a good kid." Dad nodded. "Yeah, reminds me of you at that age. Always curious." I stared at him, my throat tight. Was that a compliment? A memory? Whatever it was, it felt like a gift. When we got home, Mom had dinner ready, spaghetti, Max's favorite, and the house felt warmer, like the tension from last week was finally fading. Max was talking a mile a minute about his rocket project, and Dad actually listened, asking questions instead of shutting him down. Mom caught my eye, her smile saying she saw it too. After dinner, I put Leo's plant on my windowsill, promising myself I'd keep it alive. As I lay in bed, I thought about Dad. The kid he'd been, the man he was becoming. He was still tough, still hard-edged, but there was more to him. Layers I was just starting to understand. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time, I wasn't afraid to find out. The community center's garden was done, and the ribbon-cutting event was tomorrow. I'd spent the whole week working alongside Dad, seeing glimpses of a man I barely recognized. Someone who laughed with kids, shared scraps of his past, and even tossed me a compliment or two without a lecture attached. It was like the fight we'd had, the one that sent me storming out to the park, had cracked something open in him, but I wasn't naive. Dad was still the guy who'd ruled our house with an iron fist, who'd made me feel like I was never enough. As we headed into the weekend, I kept wondering if this new side of him would stick, or if it'd vanish like a mirage once the project was over. What I didn't expect was that the next few days would show me more of Dad than I'd ever seen, and force me to decide what kind of son I wanted to be. Saturday morning was chaos. The community center was buzzing with volunteers, setting up tables, stringing lights, and hauling in trays of food for the event. Miss Rivera was everywhere, directing traffic with a megaphone and a grin, while kids from the summer program ran around, half helping, half making a mess. Dad's crew was there, putting finishing touches on the garden, smoothing gravel paths, watering seedlings, and setting up a wooden bench they'd built as a surprise. I was tasked with hanging signs pointing to the new garden, my hands sticky with tape and sweat. Every time I glanced at Dad, he was in motion, carrying tools or talking to Miss Rivera, his face focused but not tense. He looked happy in a way I wasn't used to. Leo, my pint-sized shadow, found me while I was struggling with a crooked sign. "Jake, you coming to the party?" he asked, bouncing on his toes. "Gonna have cake," I laughed, adjusting the sign. "Wouldn't miss it, bud. You gonna save me a piece?" He nodded solemnly like it was a sacred vow, then darted off to chase a butterfly. I watched him go, feeling a weird mix of pride and protectiveness. Leo reminded me of Max, full of energy, desperate for someone to notice him. It made me think of Dad, how he'd been with Leo all week, patient and kind, in a way he rarely was with us. Why was it easier for him to show that side to strangers? The event kicked off at noon, with music blasting from speakers and a crowd of neighbors, kids, and local bigwigs milling around. Miss Rivera gave a speech, thanking everyone, but especially Dad and his crew. "Tom Harper's given us more than a garden," she said, her voice cracking a little. "He's given our kids a place to grow." The crowd clapped, and I saw Dad shift uncomfortably, his hands stuffed in his pockets. He wasn't big on attention, but I could tell he was moved. When Miss Rivera called him up to cut the ribbon, he tried to wave it off, but she insisted, and the crowd cheered him on. I snapped a picture with my phone. Dad, scissors in hand, hand, looking awkward but proud. It was the first time I'd ever thought to capture him like that. After the ribbon was cut, the garden was officially open. Kids swarmed in, touching the plants, running along the paths, and climbing on the bench. Leo grabbed my hand, dragging me to show off his tomato plants, the ones we'd planted together. "They're growing already," he said, pointing at tiny green shoots. I grinned, kneeling to get a better look. "You're a natural, Leo." He beamed, then ran off to join his friends. I stood up, dusting off my jeans, and caught Dad watching me again, his expression soft. "You're good with him," he said, walking over. "He looks up to you." I shrugged, embarrassed. "He's easy to like." Dad nodded, then added, "You're easy to like too, Jake." My breath caught. Was that affection from Dad? I mumbled a thanks, my face hot, and he clapped me on the shoulder before heading to help Pete with cleanup. The rest of the day was a blur, eating barbecue, playing games with the kids, and dodging Max, who'd shown up with Mom and was trying to rope me into a water balloon fight. Mom was in her element, chatting with neighbors and sneaking extra cookies to Leo and his friends. Dad stayed busy, but I noticed him slowing down, taking moments to talk to people, even laughing when Ms. Rivera teased him about his fancy garden design. It was surreal, seeing him like this, part of a community, not just the guy who barked orders at home or work. I kept thinking about what he'd said, about owing the center, about being a kid who needed a place like this. It made me wonder what else I didn't know about him. As the sun set, the event wound down, and most of the crowd trickled out. I was stacking chairs when Miss Rivera pulled me aside. "Jake, I need a favor," she said, her eyes serious. "There's a kid here, Marcus, who's been coming to the center for years. He's 14, good kid, but he's struggling. Could use someone to talk to, maybe show him the ropes with the garden." I hesitated. I wasn't a counselor, just a high school kid, but her face was so earnest, and I thought about Leo, how much he looked up to me. "Sure," I said. "I can try." She smiled, relieved. "Your dad said you'd be great for it. He's proud of you, you know." My stomach flipped. Dad? Proud? He'd never said it outright, not like that. I nodded, too stunned to reply, and went back to stacking chairs, my head spinning. That night, back home, the house felt different, warmer, like the air wasn't so heavy. Mom was humming in the kitchen, Max was sprawled on the couch, and Dad was in the garage, tinkering as usual. I went out to see him, something I hadn't done in years. He was cleaning his tools, the radio playing some old country song. I leaned against the workbench, watching him work. "Today was cool," I said, testing the waters. He glanced up, nodding. "Yeah, Rivera runs a good show." I took a breath, then went for it. "You didn't have to do all that, you know, the garden for free. Why'd you care so much?" He set down his rag, his hands still for once. "Told you, I owed that place," he said, his voice low. "But it's more than that. Those kids, Leo, Marcus, the rest, they're like I was. No dad." Mom stretched thin. "I didn't have anybody to show me how to be a man. Had to figure it out the hard way." He paused, his eyes meeting mine. "Don't want that for you or Max, or them." I swallowed, my throat tight. This was the most he'd ever opened up, and it wasn't just about the center, it was about us. "You're doing okay with us," I said. The words, clumsy but honest. He gave a small smile, the kind that didn't need words, and went back to his tools. The next morning, I woke up early, Leo's tomato plants still thriving on my windowsill. I decided to head back to the center, not because I had to, but because I wanted to. Marcus was there, a lanky kid with a guarded look, kicking a soccer ball against the wall. I introduced myself, feeling awkward, but he nodded, and we ended up planting a few more seedlings together. He didn't say much, but when I showed him how to space the plants, he listened, his hands copying mine. It felt good, like I was passing on something Dad had taught me, even if he hadn't meant to. Dad showed up later, dropping off some extra tools Miss Rivera had asked for. He saw me with Marcus and didn't say anything, just gave me that nod again, the one that said more than words. I realized then that this was who he was, not just the tough guy, but the man who'd fought to be better than his own dad, who'd built a garden for kids he didn't know, who was trying, in his own way, to be there for me. I wasn't sure what came next. School was starting soon, and Dad's business was still shaky, but for the first time, I felt like we were on the same team. Back home, Max was working on his rocket project, and I helped him glue some fins, laughing when he got glitter all over the table. Mom watched us, her eyes soft, and when Dad came in, he didn't snap at Max for the mess. Instead, he sat down, asking, "That thing gonna fly?" Max lit up, explaining his design, and Dad listened. Really listened. I caught Mom's eye, and she smiled, like she knew we were all finding our way. As I headed to bed, I looked at Leo's plant, its leaves catching the moonlight. It was small, fragile, but growing, kind of like us.